Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today, Craig Harbour, the Chief Technology Officer for Fidelis Cybersecurity. Now, Craig, before break, we were talking a lot about the attack surface came up with this idea of agencies have had 40 or 50 different tools that didn't integrate, and that could create seams. But there's also the other side, if you will, that the attack surface could actually be beneficial for agencies. Maybe talk a little bit your thoughts about how agencies can put the attack surface to work for them.
Sure. So I think one of the things that I know even Fidelis is looking at is deception technology, right? And the idea with deception technology is how do we essentially use that to our advantage? I'll say that being us, being the good guys, right, rather than the attackers. So the attackers have always been able to look for one way in where the defenders had to be able to defend every possible combination of things that an attacker can do. And so there's always been this concern about lateral movement, and once they get in, and how do you detect lateral movement? And so from the perspective of an attacker, right, what they like to see is an environment that's fairly static, that they understand it, that they essentially can develop their operations. They know exactly what they want to do. What would be frustrating to an adversary is an environment that changes, one that's dynamic, one where the attack surface, for example, is not in their favor. So if you think about the attack surface as being, these are the paths that they can go down, and they try to do that in a very, I'll say, silent way. What if we introduced additional assets through deception, right, that aren't real? Additional endpoint assets, additional IoT assets, so that what was potentially 100 endpoint devices just became 1,000 or 10,000. The reality is, if they engage those assets, we know that it's an attacker. They shouldn't be there. So it really creates a high fidelity infrastructure for us to constantly monitor and look for. And then we can do a couple different things. We can use it to gain intelligence about how does the adversary behave. So when we talked a little bit earlier about determining the unknowns, right, we can use that from an intelligence standpoint to really understand adversaries, how they're going to behave, what techniques they're using. Or we can use it to automatically trigger our defensive capabilities and say, look, if this happens, there's kind of the automated response. We're going to take the following action to take that adversary off our network.
It's a great idea. I did a story a couple months ago. Sandia National Labs within the Energy Department is putting together a dynamic honeypot. Very similar, probably something where they're saying we can kind of lure the adversary in,
right,
and then make it seem like it's a real network and watch them move through and pick and give them fake data and fake information and fake systems. And then once they're in, then we can develop the others are real defenses. It seems very similar to that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with those folks at Sandia.
Very familiar, and actually it's very much what the Fidelis platform does as well. It's the use of breadcrumbs to essentially really to lure the attacker to that network of deception tools.
Is this something that, beyond the pilot or the test at Sandia, is this something that other agencies are starting to look into? I mean, I don't know what you can talk about from the NSA perspective or the intelligence world, but is this something that they're starting to look into a little bit?
So, this technology isn't really new technology. I think
the honeypot has been around forever.
Honeypot's been around, and I think the challenge was how do you operationalize that capability? And so I think what you're seeing with some of the dynamic deception tools that are out there is their ability to essentially sense the environment. So when we were talking earlier about visibility, the fact that I understand what are my assets on the network allows me in a very dynamic fashion to say, but what if I wanted to introduce additional? I don't need somebody to program that in. I can actually learn based on what's in my environment and automatically deploy these capabilities and introduce those things like breadcrumbs to lure. So I think where the technology has advanced to in the last couple of years allows this now to be something that can be truly operationalized. And there's a number of different articles out there that are looking at the technology. Lots of different federal agencies have come to us, I know, for proof of concepts to really better understand how to essentially manage this capability.
And part of the reason why this is possible, you mentioned the technology has advanced, is this broad acceptance, but also really transformation that artificial intelligence, machine learning, predictive analytics, whatever we're going to call it, really has added to the cyber defense. Where does AI, ML, and whatever other emerging technologies we want to talk to fit into this discussion?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned a number of different technologies that are part of this, right? So let's start with the basics, right? Automation. I think automation is a key capability that actually needs to be readily adopted across not only the federal government but industry. I'll tell you, it was probably about 5 years ago. I was at one of the service labs, and at the time we were working on active cyber defense, and this was when SOAR tools just became about, right? Secure orchestration capabilities. We took a capability down to this particular service, demonstrated it, they loved it, and we thought that we were actually going to deploy the capability. Wasn't but a couple hours later, all of a sudden there was this realization that we were going to make automatic changes to their infrastructure. And they were like, well, wait a minute, no, we're not comfortable with that. So automation really is something that I think is it's taking a little bit of time for that user acceptance to understand that machines can learn and machines can make decisions if we do the right thing. So when I think about machine learning and artificial intelligence, it really is to help us to go that next level where we can take data feeds, right? Data or sensor feeds that we're pulling from all these different devices that we've deployed across our networks. And we can make smart decisions based on our understanding. So I think you'll see that there's a lot of work to do, kind of complex correlations to really understand and look for what is that adversary doing on our networks. And then it's not just the kind of the making sense of what they're doing. It's also, so how are we going to respond? So start to think about decision making. So it's one thing to be able to present to an operator, an owner of a network, says, well, you have all these things going on, you got all these problems. Their next question is, so what should I do next? Right. And I think we can actually use machine learning to also do not only the sense making, but help with automated decision making, then allow really the machines to execute these changes in an automated fashion, right? Because if we're not going to get to the point of operating what I'll call cyber relevant time, and allowing adversaries or attackers to be on our networks for hundreds of days, that's not cyber relevant time. That's just a problem happening, right? So we really need to get out in front of it. And I believe these technologies will really allow us to discover new things that the adversary is doing, and in a cyber relevant time be able to take action and respond.
We hear a lot about automation when it comes to DevSec, DevOps and DevSecOps. That's automating the security of that development, the software development. What you're talking about here, though, and I think just to put maybe a finer point on it again, is that the computer is saying, I'm finding this ping that's happening on this port, I'm going to shut down that port right now because I realize that's not right, or based on what the human, if you will, has told the machine that's not right. I mean, that's without automation. I know I'm simplifying it.
Well, I think it's that, and I think it's also, a file comes across, we think there's something potentially bad with that file, right? And in the past, there was a manual process that an analyst would go through to try to make a determination, is this good, is this bad? And part of the challenge was they were, I'll say, interacting with a lot of different systems to come to that ultimate decision of, is it good or it's bad? And that might be, we're not talking even minutes later. Sometimes it took hours for that to occur. Well, you can take all those manual steps that an analyst does and essentially use an orchestration capability to automate that entire workflow. So what was taking potentially hours can now be done really in minutes and even in seconds, depending on how complex the set of steps were.
Where are you seeing this happening, whether in government or other sectors? Where are we with this move toward automation? You said we need to go faster or get it done, but where are we with it?
I think we're really, I'd like to think that we were further along. I almost feel like in the last 5 years that my life has stood still, because part of the whole active cyber defense program that I worked on, the focus was how to deploy orchestration capabilities, secure orchestration capabilities to do this automation. And I think what you're seeing now really is a combination of things happening. I think a lot of vendors recognize the need to be able to do a lot more integrated, automated work within their platforms. So our product, like a number of products that are out there, have those capabilities built in. So when we detect something on our network device, for example, we very quickly share that with our endpoint device. And it may result in, we detect something, we think it's bad, have the endpoint quarantining, or a number of the endpoint devices quarantine, right? So we're very quickly making decisions. If I go back to our earlier comment about how do we get to that streamlined security stack, I really need the ability to also be able to operate outside or external to my own environment. And I think that's true for all the vendors that are kind of building this set of devices. And so to be able to very quickly work with orchestration tools, I'll tell you, if you looked at orchestration tools 4 or 5 years ago, there were probably 2 out in the market. I think today there's probably 40 plus out in the market. There are some that are more dominant than others, and I think it's really trying to think through those workflows of what makes sense. So I continue to always go back to the cyber threat framework. The framework helps me understand what to detect, and it also gives me guidance on how to respond. And it's now taking those ideas and essentially transforming it into playbooks that exist within these products. So I think we're just kind of, you're starting to see that now, and it's really starting to advance pretty quickly.
Craig, this has been a fascinating conversation. We're just about out of time, but I did want to hit upon one last topic area briefly is around the workforce. All this is really to help the workforce bring the human side, make them more valuable, upskill them, if you will. Talk about what type of skill sets or where does the workforce need to go as we look at the changing, the evolution of cybersecurity.
Yeah, so you're right. I think the discussion we're just having on automation really becomes a workforce multiplier, right? It allows what would have taken 10 people, I can automate, and now I can have potentially 2 people doing that job. And the value is I can now free those 8 other people up to do more complex analysis. I think one of the biggest challenges within this community is the skill set and getting skilled analysts and operators that are out there. One of the things that I mentioned, I worked at NSA. NSA has actually been probably one of the leaders trying to work not only at the college level or at the university level or with the military services. They've been working with the high schools, right? They're starting down at that level, more at a grassroots level, to even bring an awareness, because a lot of these kids going through high school, thinking about what they want to do in college, cybersecurity is not the first thing on their mind, right?
Video games, I think, right?
Video games.
Video games.
But there's NSA has brought things like the Codebreaker Challenge. I believe you did a session once before in that. And it really does a great job of explaining the value and the role that we play within the cybersecurity community. And it really has raised a lot of kind of awareness about what it is, and a lot of people going into the career field.
I think one of the things that we're seeing is agencies are depending on these tools, these capabilities to free up their workforce, really to find that needle in the haystack. Let the technology do the manual work, or what was traditionally manual work. Is that the biggest, if you will, if you look forward just in like 10, 20 seconds or less, is that the biggest change that we should expect, that the role of the cyber worker is going to change?
Yeah, I think so. I think automation is going to really be an assist to that worker, and I think what you're going to see then is the assist does 2 things. One, it will help train, because we can automate the way we do analysis, so that junior workforce coming up can use that to essentially train themselves to be that next generation, I'll say more senior workforce. And I think you're going to see that senior workforce really start to dig into what are these complex analysis that need to be done to really find the rest of the unknowns that are out there and really help us think through how do we really operate these and really create the efficiencies that we need in our environments so that our business systems do what we expect them to do.
All right, this is a huge challenge. I know we could talk longer, but unfortunately we are out of time for today. Let me thank my guest, Craig Harber, the Chief Technology Officer for Fidelis Cybersecurity. Craig, thank you so much for your time.
Great, thank you.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search innovation.